Okay, maybe it's best we don't have any young people like Ed here tonight as we look at this very salacious chapter of Genesis 38. That's where we'll be tonight, Genesis 38. This is a interesting digression from the Joseph narrative, which began in chapter 37. This is one of those chapters the scholars go back and look at and wonder why it's here, and especially here, and there's no real definitive or clear rationale that anyone has been able to discern other than this is it. This is where it's at. It's in the context and to be understood of what is called the Levirate marriage. You can find it in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. And this practice was of a brother living close to another brother. The brother dies married but without heir. The surviving brother would take his wife and as his own wife, one of his wives, and the first child they have together is the heir for the deceased brother. He continues his line. It's also a big part of the story of Ruth, and it's kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that. My only guess, if then this is just a really guess by someone who's not qualified really to make one, I suppose. Hello, Sherry, Robin, and Mindy. My only guess as to why it's in the Bible and why it's here. Joseph is going to be the preeminent heir of Jacob. He is the number one son in sentiment, in Joseph's sentiment, and politically moving forward in a sense, because there is no tribe of Joseph, is there? In the tribe of Israel. There's two tribes of Joseph in a sense, Manasseh and Ephraim. So he is kind of takes the top seat over and above his elder brothers. And we've already seen the first three sons that Jacob had, and he had them all with his wife Leah, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. They have all dishonored themselves, or at least incurred the wrath of their father Jacob. How did Simeon and Levi incur the wrath of their father? Wally and Thelma say hi too. No, they made it. Mindy's having back problems and sciatica, so she's going to have some treatment there. How did Simeon and Levi dishonor or anger their father? The whole community, the whole community of Shechem, in revenge of their daughter or their sister Dinah. Okay, and again, that's a difficult story. It's a sexual story, and it's a story of violence, and it looks like kind of like an Old Testament, the kind of story where the Old Testament characters would all be on board. You do something bad to our family, we're going to rain down vengeance upon you. But Jacob isn't happy with it. Jacob is upset because he was willing to kind of dwell. He wants to dwell peacefully in the community. I'm not saying one side or the other is right. It could be a case of where they're both wrong. But Jacob and maybe the early audiences in context would have seen that revenge to be disproportionate to the offense. It was not an eye for an eye. It was a life for an eye, many lives for an eye. And that's one way of looking at it. I'm not trying to tell people how they should feel about that story, but that is perhaps how the early audiences thought about it and how Jacob is supposed to be feeling about it in context with dwelling in the land surrounded by enemies. And Reuben, how did he incur his father's anger? Yeah. He had sex with, was it Bilhah or Zilpah? I forget. I think it was Bilhah. So Reuben had committed adultery against his father. And Bilhah, verse 22 of Genesis chapter 35. So the first three of the four sons have dishonored themselves, or at the very least angered their father. Judah is the fourth son. Now, Judah has done something in a sense that would anger his father if his father knew about it. Remember, they're going to kill Joseph, the dreamer. He's going to be killed. So they throw him in the pit because Reuben intervenes. Reuben is trying to buy some time, trying to deliver Joseph and returning back to his father. But while Reuben is away, Judah comes up with the bright idea, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites. And that's what happens. Now, if Jacob knew all of that, how do you think Jacob would feel about Judah? Oh, well. His thoughts on his sons are somewhat reflected towards the end of the chapter in Genesis, the end of the book. In Genesis chapter 49, he prophesies about his sons, and he points out the failings of both Reuben and Simeon and Levi. He, on the other hand, speaks pretty glowingly about Judah, a very favorable prophecy concerning Judah. So it could be that Jacob goes to his grave in ignorance of Judah's role in all this. So with that being said, with Judah's both his bad acting and the fact that maybe his father didn't know about it, and historically Judah's rise to being the preeminent tribe, ultimately Judah becomes the preeminent tribe. It's the house of David. This is the line of Jesus. Perhaps with all that going on, this story is included in order to kind of put Judah a little bit in his place, put the whole tribe in their place. This is a story of Judah's unrighteousness, but it is not perhaps the unrighteousness that we would take out of this, that we would be most appalled by. So with all of that fun stuff said, let's get into this very fun chapter. So in Genesis 38, verses 1 through 11. Judah's marriage, sorry, reading my notes. 1 through 11. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. And so she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Chezib that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I am afraid that he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar lived with her father's house. your outline, if you have a copy of it, may say father-in-law's house. So I may have, I'm not exactly sure. I may have messed that up on the outline. That may be something that needs to be corrected. Okay, so what do we think about this first 11 verses here?
A lot of weird customs back then.
Robert's got to have some thoughts on this.
My comment was going to be problem. I'm not sure we understand the full everything about this story because we're not in that time in that era. And to me, looking at that, it's so difficult and so different than what we know today. But I'm sure, hopefully, you have some context. What is the proper way that things should have been done versus what was done? Or was this at the time an approved way of doing things?
Yeah, it's,
The women with the kids, the whole thing.
I think I think the Mosaic Law provision about this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, is a law made to make the custom official. This is what we were already doing. There is this community social interest in preserving especially a man who has the means to get married and everything, preserving his line. They do not want his line to disappear. The child genetically, of course, would have been Onan's child, but legally, it would have been Er's child. That was the purpose, to keep Er's line around. Now, if you look at both sides, it's hard to understand why either line needs to really be perpetrated. But at the same time, maybe the line of Judah is at stake here. And as bad as it looks right now, the line of Judah is, again, the line of Jesus. So you have, from playing the long game, looking at the long view, this is a blip. This is just a moment, and but that's this communal interest in preserving someone's line. And again, the difference, I think the core difference for us, why we struggle to conceive or understand these ideas, is that we have a very different approach to marriage. We have very different ideas about what marriage is supposed to be. Women have a very different role in securing their own spouse. And, sometimes people say these arranged marriages would be better. I don't know that you could say that coming here. But if your husband was so evil, God struck him dead, and his brother was as bad or worse and got struck dead by God, how anxious would you be for your father-in-law to continue to set you up with other people? At the same time, Tamar expects that. It is Judah that's scared of putting his son with this femme fatale, I guess you could say. For some reason, men are dropping dead around her, but there's no indication that she's done anything wrong in this role whatsoever. But God had a way of providing for women that most women today would find totally repugnant. But that doesn't mean it wasn't the best reasonable means available to the culture and the people at the time, that they may have viewed it very differently.
That's why the point of trying to I have to do it in a different manner than today. It's not today, it's what exists today. And as a parent, you think that not as good, or he could have struck him dead. So there's still, I guess, more to the story here.
Mm-hmm.
You do things that God doesn't want you to do. As a result of the action, consequence of your actions. To see that too.
Yes. And the overriding ethic in all this, the overriding interest that God has in this is not sexual purity. It is the provision for a widow, because widows were so intrinsically vulnerable in this culture. So all of this having this other child, that's the deceit, that puts the wife in a position perhaps of some guardianship, but also to receive some security from her dead husband who left her with no heir. It is a provision for the protection of widows. And that is at the very core of God's calling for Israel, is to protect the most vulnerable people in their society. And who are those? In three broad categories: widows, orphans, and aliens. Because they can't look out for themselves. And for aliens, you were once aliens.
We were not part of God's.
Well, Israel was aliens. Israel went down to Egypt as aliens.
Oh, yeah.
And Egypt let Israel survive, ultimately enslaving them. But we'll see, that's kind of a plot twist later on too. But, even if you look at the treatment of Egypt on Israel as wholly bad, which it was not, but if you look at it that way, that's still reason for you to do better, isn't it? If you got treated shabbily in one stage of life, shouldn't that motivate you to treat someone else in that stage of life when you're in a different position, treat them better? If you start a job and your supervisor is mean to you, when you become a supervisor and someone else starts their job, are you going to be mean to them? Are you going to haze the freshman the way you were hazed when you were a freshman, whatever? That kind of thing. Or are you going to treat them better? And God wants Israel to treat their weak people better. He wants them to treat the widows, the orphan, and it's a passage you see over and over and again. And you especially see it when God is indicting Israel before he delivers Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah, into Babylonian captivity. You need to go back and purify yourself. Yes, tear down the idols, but defend the orphan, defend the widow, defend the alien. Practice justice. So this is the key moral issue here, is the provision for a widow. It's not who is having sex with who. Although for us, that's kind of what leaps out. Because our widows have Social Security. Our widows have life insurance. Our widows were not, sold into marriage by their father to begin with, and can go out and find another, Paul tells young widows to what? Remarry, right? You have some freedoms and ability to go out and make a life for yourself. But even in Paul's commandment, you see still the path forward for a woman is almost never of her own direction. It's never like we try to teach our daughters, get a good job and a good education and everything so you can take care of yourself in case your husband turns out like Rick, right? In case your husband married you turns out not to be a good husband, you can take care of yourself. They didn't teach their daughters that back then. Their daughters didn't know how to read. Their daughters were raised to be wives and mothers. In the home, that's it. And so when their husband dies, they need another home to go to, basically. And in this case, Judah sends Tamar back to her father's house, perhaps with some provision or something like that, so that her father would take her back. Maybe they were more welcoming than some. A lot of these old cultures, once they sold the daughter off into marriage, they didn't want anything to do with her. They'd gotten their money. She comes back, it's another mouth to feed. So, you don't come back home. But the deaths of these two sons, it's not an introduction to this topic, but it introduces fear into the story. Judah is afraid. He is afraid to continue to look out for the community and instead starts looking after his own personal interest. His interest is keeping his line and his money his for his children. That's his interest. And what happens to the community doesn't really matter all that much. I'm going to take care of myself. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago, and maybe it's happened here. I don't know. I'm not trying to condemn anybody now. You know, we see these celebrities, their past is, it's all recorded and everything, so it's catching up to them, and how they make jokes or treated people of, you know, some minority status, or if they were women, how they treated them 30 years ago as being, okay, look what you did to this person, and you're canceled. You know, it's our cancel culture. You know, when you hold those kind of standards up to our current culture, these things don't look all that good. But they are also pushing back on this idea that Americans have had for a long time, which is we are this individual, rugged individual culture where everybody goes out and they have the liberty and the freedom to make their own way in the world. And you go out and you be competitive and you beat everybody and you get what you want, what you need, take it from someone else. That was not God's intention for Israel. I do not believe that's God's intention for the church. You know, you had communal responsibilities too. You know, the woman you're shafting, the woman you're shorting, is your sister. The woman with 2 mites to put in the box, with all these rich people putting all their money in, the 2-mite widow, she is all those rich people's sister. And all she has to live on are 2 mites. That's not God's intention. So the culture has failed in a lot of ways, and we have not exactly picked up where they failed and made it all right with our own look at these sort of things. Okay, 12 through 19. Now after considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers in Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. She removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, Here now, let me come into you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What will you give me that you may come into me? He said, Therefore I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it? He said, What pledge shall I give you? And she said, Your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. Okay. It's NC-17 night, huh?
At least.
I'm glad we don't live there.
You didn't look at your father-in-law that way, did you, Karen? No.
Well, she would want an heir so that she could be taken care of, right? If she doesn't have a husband, if she has a male son, then he's going to take care of her.
Judah has no intention of taking care of her, though, does he? He's not going to send his son to her because he's afraid he'll end up dead too.
Well, I mean, maybe part of her motive in her plan was so that she could have an heir, a son, and maybe to take care of her.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She's not trying to get a young goat.
She got her an old goat, but
She got her an old goat,
Well, and she targeted.
a certain kind of old goat. I don't know, I'm gonna say what it is though. Yes,
I
sir.
mean, she realized that that his son was not going to fulfill his duty, and she targeted him, it would look like to me. I mean, she, for somehow or other, she knew where he would be traveling.
and his weakness,
Uh,
and his weakness.
well, yeah, I suppose.
I think one of the most interesting things is the disparity between the widowhood experience. A young woman is widowed and becomes basically cloistered, and as far as Judah is concerned, for the rest of her life, out of sight, out of mind. He becomes widowed.
Party time.
He's going to the lounge at the Holiday Inn, seeing what's got what, basically. I mean, he's on the make now. Okay, my wife died. You kind of get the feeling that probably didn't have a whole lot to do with it either. I mean, when he was out and about, And there's something, and we'll look at it a little bit more in the next passage, but her portrayal of a prostitute, it's depicted kind of differently at different times in the passage. But there was a difference between in the Canaanite culture, not the Jewish culture necessarily, but the Canaanite culture, a difference between a temple prostitute and a common streetwalker, I guess you would call it, a common harlot. The temple prostitute is doing the work of their god. I mean, generating contributions, and and they would have male and female temple prostitutes. Name your pleasure. So it's something God deals with in the Mosaic Law. He's not approval of it at all. But this is in the Canaanite culture. I guess you could say Judah may have thought he was going to a reputable woman of disrepute, a temple prostitute, and that brings in some theological issues in terms of idolatry. Is this, are we supporting a false god? Are we practicing idolatry along with the sexual misconduct? So Judah hasn't looked good yet, has he?
Yeah,
He's going to look good later on, but he's not looking good in this story. He's not going to look good later on in this story, but he will look good later on, much later on. He'll look a little bit better, at least a little better. But this is not his high point. This is not what he puts on his resume. So, okay, verses 20 through 26. When Judah, we're not coming back to this story next week, I can assure you. 20 through 26. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, Where's the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? But they said, There has been no temple prostitute there or here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her, and furthermore, the men of the place say there hasn't been no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, Let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. I held up my end of the bargain, and Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah said, Bring her out and let her be burned. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, Please examine and see, whose signet ring and cords and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. And I think that is understandable. This is a plot twist worthy of the great bard William Shakespeare, isn't it? Just kind of. Whenever characters in the Old Testament make these grandiose, big, bold, bad statements, how tough they're going to be, and it's usually setting them up. They're about to fall on their own sword. And their pride really does go before. Outraged that his daughter-in-law, a widowed woman, would play the harlot. But this widower had no problem playing with a harlot. That's the disparity of the culture that's going on here. And we have our attitudes and thoughts, and I haven't polled the audience here. I don't know what everyone's thoughts are. And I can't, there's a story I meant to get permission to share, and I can't share it. When you think about the women that are still involved, it's called the world's oldest profession for a reason. And it's easy to have a very dim view of these sex workers. I would ask you to consider that if there was no demand, there would be no supply. And we live in a culture and a country that at least tries to help unwanted or orphaned children out financially, so try to support them to some extent. I'm not saying we're doing all we should or all we can. We do something. My question to leave you with on that issue is, what would you do to feed your children? You're a widow with children, nobody supporting you. You didn't marry into the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You married into some guy who didn't make all that much money. He had some kids. He dies. I know she doesn't have kids here, but what would you do to feed your children? I mean, throughout history, how many of people in this position who are actually doing what Tamar is pretending to do, how many of them felt like they did not have really any other choice? I'll just ask you to consider the vulnerability there. Even though Tamar is not actually a harlot, she is very vulnerable. She is about to be burned for being pregnant during her widowhood. And she turns over her whole card. And it's three of a kind. And they all say Judah, 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 Judah.
I'm glad I didn't live during that time.
Well, I'm glad we have you with us right now, Karen. If you'd lived back then, you wouldn't be with us here today. So we're glad you're here. So the righteousness that Judah is confessing is lacking in his own life. It's not ever that he visited a prostitute. The unrighteousness is that he was unwilling. He says here, I would not give her my son Shelah. I would not comport to the requirements of the community. I looked after my own interests instead of the interest of the community. It's better for my son to go to her than for me. Tamar, like Ruth, with the guidance of Naomi, is working out her own salvation. If she never marries again, never has children, again, a lot of people think, well, if a woman can't find a good guy, she shouldn't get married, she shouldn't have kids. That's fine, again, in a world where women have a lot of options with their whole lives. In a world where they are only in existence to be wives and mothers, to tell a woman, first of all, it's not up to her, it's up to her father. But to tell a woman, you can't be what a woman is. You're here to be a wife and a mother. Well, don't marry that guy and be a wife and a mother because he's not good enough. Well, you're denying her, you're really, in a sense, killing her with that requirement. You are cutting off her life. Her life has no purpose. It can have no purpose. So to save her life, she has to work out her own salvation. She figures out this plan. Judah owes me. And what was she owed? Not a certain amount of money. She was owed a child. She was owed sexual access to the line of Judah. That was her right. Absolutely her right. In a culture where women did not have rights, she had that right. And she went out and got it. And she did better, really. She did better than having a grandson of Judah. She has two, ultimately, we probably won't read it, but she has two sons of Judah. These are now Shelah's little brothers. God using human weakness, using Judah's weakness to perfect his strength, to lift up, to defend the widow. And she was owed a grandson of Judah. She gets two sons of Judah. Yes, sir.
The statement there in verse 26, where he said, she is more righteous than I. Stop and think about that. She said, therefore, she was more righteous even though she paid the first part of it. And Judah, he wouldn't give her what he was supposed to give. And he admits it. And to me, the fact that here's Judah, who's supposed to be the strong guy, admitting this woman, who's considered to be a lower status, more righteous. I guess it shows that Judah is still finally willing to stand up and take the lumps from his way. He didn't before.
This might have been an epiphany for Judah. This might have been a life-changing moment from the man who will sell his own brother into Egyptian slavery, what becomes Egyptian slavery, able to see his own lack of righteousness and the righteousness of his daughter-in-law, even though she has tricked him. She tricked him. But tricking isn't exactly new in this household, is it? Pulling a trick on somebody. She'll fit right in with this group. But that is the unrighteousness. It's not that he went to a prostitute. The unrighteousness is that he would not honor the widow's right, the widow's plea. An unrighteous judge will give in to the widow if she persists. Well, this widow persisted.
Either had to or did on his own admit.
Yes. And again, the unrighteousness he admits to is in not giving Shelah to him, not in that I did not pay company with
the other part, but we don't
fallen woman there.
understand how strong this was in that culture. He was not.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it wasn't his son Shelah that was in the line of Jesus. It was Perez.
Yes, Perez.
Yeah.
But it's all Judah still.
Yeah, it's all Judah, but it wasn't from another, it was from her.
Because, yes, Tamar, that's one of the things. I think it's Matthew's genealogy that has the women. And the women it mentions in Jesus' genealogy are very scandalous women.
Yeah.
It's Rahab. Even Ruth. Again, if you look at Ruth, this is kind of closing on a tangent, I guess. But what does Ruth do to get Boaz's romantic attention?
Down on his bed, into his bed.
And what does she do on the bed? She uncovers his feet. Feet is a euphemism frequently in the biblical context, especially in the Old Testament. Feet is a euphemism for private areas of the body. Boaz doesn't wake up and his feet are showing with a woman laying right there. So what? I mean, he's walking around in sandals all the time. Boaz wakes up and something else is showing with a woman right there. All of a sudden, his gender is on full display. And when he does, what does Naomi say? He will not rest until God's justice is done. When men somewhat identify with the plight women have in cultures, at least historically, you can say they have it now or they don't. I don't know. But when men are forced to identify and truly understand and not just sympathize with, but empathize with, understand what it's like to be a woman in these cultures, things change radically. And in this story and in Ruth, God's provision is met. God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. And when men and women are totally in their own different worlds, and men have no idea what women have to go through and what they have to put up with, when all they do, the only person Judah can really understand is himself. He's so afraid of losing his last son, he only thinks about himself. When he does that, the plight of the widow gets worse. When for a second he realizes what she put at stake, what is at stake in her life, and perhaps the difference in his own life. Just a glimmer of that, and all of a sudden everything changes. Male and female, he created them. When we look at all of the problems we have in our world today around the issues of sexuality and gender, they did not just pop up overnight. They did not just happen out of nowhere. How long have human beings been in a situation where men basically oppressed women? They oppressed their own wives. They do not treat them like the gift from God they are. All they can do is, what I do sometimes, which is play the Willie Nelson song, "You Were Always on My Mind," I could have done a lot better, but you were on my mind, But when it happens, when they are forced to be vulnerable, the way women are always vulnerable, things change. When God tips the scale, when he turns the world slightly upside down, towards upside down, not really upside down, but just towards upside down, a little bit, 1 degree, everything changes. The desire to maintain the status quo with people with wealth and power is so strong, they can't get past it. But when they are forced past it, then things change. Okay. Yes, the birth of Perez and his full brother, his twin brother, Zerah, are described in verses 27 through 30. We won't, we're over time anyway, so we're not going to talk about it, but it is vaguely reminiscent of the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau. There's a little bit of correlation there. They're twins, if nothing else. So, yes, Jesus comes. We want to talk about redemption, God redeeming all of this. This is the household that brings us Jesus. So, does that make it okay to begin with? No. I mean, both of these sexual encounters are not ideal. They are not the intention God has for men and women being together sexually. But God can redeem anything. David and Bathsheba were not God's intention. But from David and Bathsheba comes Solomon, the heir to the throne. Okay. Sorry to keep you late. It is cooking in here tonight. Maybe it's just me reading this story, getting all hot and bothered. I don't know. Hi, Kim. You folks there online and here, have a good evening. Mr. White, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir?